Hello, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, depending on where you're living. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Rebecca Thistlethwaite, and I am the program manager with a niche meat processor assistance network. We are a national community of practice focused on the long-term viability of small and mid-scale meat processors who are essential to the local and regional meat and poultry sectors. We are an extension community of practice housed at Oregon State University, but we work on a national and sometimes international scale. This topic today on feasibility studies was inspired by a lot of requests this year by different meat processors who are thinking about expanding or purchasing new businesses, as well as some beginning meat processors who were thinking about getting started and really didn't know where to begin. And so I was doing a lot of one-on-one assistance with meat processors and trying to encourage them to first do a feasibility study and really do some quality research and homework before they embarked on potentially spending millions of dollars. So that's why the title of this webinar today is "This Study May Save You Millions," because if you write a good feasibility study, it may actually save you millions of dollars, because it could perhaps tell you that another option is a better idea for you. So we're thrilled to have a couple really experienced bang-up consultants from Kitchen Table Consultants. We have Ted LeBow, who's the co-founder and principal of Kitchen Table Consultants. And we have Rebecca Frimmer, who's an entrepreneur in residence at Kitchen Table, and who's also written several of their feasibility studies in the meat processing space. So they are going to take it from here, and I am just going to turn it over to them to use their expertise on how to write a high-quality feasibility study for your meat processing business. All right, take it away, Ted.
Great. So I just wanted to start off by saying thank you so much. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk to a group of people thinking about the meat processing world. And I just want to take a short second to give a little background of Kitchen Table Consultants and what we do. We've been around since 2009. There's 13 of us up and down the Eastern Seaboard, Chicago, and California. Rebecca Frimmer is in California. What do? We advise and coach businesses. We do small business bookkeeping setup. We do hands-on help and project management. And we do an interim virtual management team. And inside that stuff, we do a number of business plans and feasibility studies, but they're always with the eye on the entrepreneur and how we make sure that they're actually getting value out of that. And so part of this seminar that we're giving is about making sure that when you do something like this, you make sure you A, ask the right questions, and B, get the right feedback, and C, at the end of the day, we have been equally proud when a feasibility study or a business plan comes back and says don't do something as opposed to doing something, because it's certainly a lot cheaper, as Rebecca mentioned, to spend the time and the money up front to do that study, that investment in time, as opposed to starting to do bricks and mortar and paying people and getting to millions of dollars. So with that said, I'm going to let Rebecca get into the meat of the conversation. No pun intended.
Thanks, Ted. We're going to go back and forth a little bit here throughout the webinar. So you'll I'll do a section, Ted will do a section, and we'll go back and forth, but just stay with us here. So this is our agenda for today. In brief, we're going to talk about the outline for a feasibility study, but first we'll talk a little bit about why you might want to do one and the process and some of the pitfalls to look out for throughout the process. And then we'll go through some of the segments of the feasibility study itself, what makes up the market study, the competition analysis, workforce assessment, and financial analysis, and then ultimately choosing the correct business structure, the most appropriate, there's no correct, the most appropriate business structure to go along with your goals. And then we'll talk a little bit about how to dissect the information and interpret what your study is telling you. So right off the bat, why is a feasibility study so important? Well, as the slide says here, building or renovating a processing facility without a thorough investigation of your key success factors can result in a financial disaster. I mean, really, you're about to make a major investment, and you want to look before you leap and figure out if all of the different stakeholders are going to come together for you to be successful. And really a feasibility study is a failure avoidance strategy. So as I said, you wouldn't leap before you look. So let's talk a little bit about why a feasibility study matters and how they can benefit your startup or your remodel. What happens if you might move forward without one, or what could happen, and a little bit about how it's different or how it does look like a business plan. So as we're saying, because you're about to make this major investment, you need to make sure that you can return on that investment, whether you're doing, whatever kind of financing you ultimately go with, you need to be able to pay back that investment. And a lot of different players need to be able to come together for you to be successful with either a plant startup or a plant remodel, because the remodel is probably going to be the launch pad of offering some different services. So who are all those stakeholders? I mean, we have to think about our prospective customer base. We have to think about local legislation and regulatory folks that have to give you the approval to make this happen. You want to think about your investors or your financiers and what kind of a case you're presenting to them to invest in your startup or your remodel. And then you also have some other stakeholders in your management team and your workforce. And if you don't have all of these factors figured out before you go ahead and you make an investment or you finance something, your chances of success are going to be limited because you don't really know that you've investigated all of those major factors. So that's really the purpose of the feasibility study and why it matters. And then diving in with that one, I think the answer is pretty obvious, right? You're setting yourself up to fail in one of those areas because you haven't looked under the hood, so to speak, before you move forward. So how does it look like a business plan, and how is it different? This is a question that, we hear a lot. So the feasibility study is really the launch pad or the springboard for the business plan itself. It's the first step. It's going to be that broad, informative framework that you want to use to inform your business plan. It's going to cover taking a look at the market, the influences on your eventual operations, and the book of services that you'll be offering. And then the business plan later will dive into much more detail on the finances, the budget, and then the operations and marketing plan in much greater detail. So the feasibility study at a high level is going to answer the questions like, do I have potential supply to make this work? Do I have the ability to finance this, or at least a really good idea of how I could finance it and how much I need to do so, roughly? And is there community support for this, right? Legislatively and regulatorily, and just in general from the people that are farming and using those services in your region. If all three of those areas come back as a positive yes, then you're going to take that next step and you're going to do a business plan.
Hey, Rebecca, your slides aren't rolling forward on the screen, at least.
Are they moving now?
They are.
Okay. Moving on. The process and the pitfalls. So ultimately, the biggest pitfall that we see is time and procrastination and objectivity. So if you ask yourself, what can you really do yourself, but you have a timeline, you want to get things started, you need to put some papers in front of potential investors and respond to those in your community that want to move this project forward from an economic development standpoint, how long is it going to take you to do the feasibility study if you do it all on your own? Because then your next step is going to be the business plan too. You probably have other work on your plate. How much free time do you really have? These are big projects that might take over 100 hours of work. So think about what can you really commit, and are you generally a procrastinator, or are you really good at self-management, project management, and getting things done? And then can you be objective? Are you going to tell yourself what you really want to hear because you really want to do this project? Or are you going to be able to objectively look at the data on your own? So what would you expect from a consultant if you decided to bring somebody on board, or how can you, mediate pitfalls in that process? I think the simple answer is that you want to hire a consultant to do the things that you really don't feel comfortable doing, you don't know how to do, or you don't have time to do. So you want to vet consultants. You always want to interview more than one consultant. You want to make sure they're experts in what they say they're actually experts in. Do your research and ask for some references. And then we want to make sure there's a good, solid project plan. We need an understanding of what the mutual expectations are, what the outcomes are going to be, and what the roadmap is to get there. So what are the benchmarks along the way that we're going to know we're on our way to getting this done on time? And if you feel really comfortable and confident in all of those areas, then you've probably found the right person to work with. And you also want somebody who's going to be able to, give you a bit of a sanity check and be objective against, you know, perhaps what might be some more emotional goals that you might have yourself because you really want something. So for the next portion of this presentation, I'm going to toss it back to Ted. He's going to talk about a specific feasibility study that we just finished working on called A Leg Up, and talk about that example and our objectives in that report. All right, take it away, Ted.
Thanks, Rebecca. Very quickly, this was not actually a feasibility study as much as it was to create a foundation for a feasibility study. Kitchen Table Consultants was approached by the Blue Yak Foundation and Pennsylvania Association for Sustainable Agriculture because in Southeast Pennsylvania, there was the feeling or the thought that there was not enough meat processing available. And what they asked is, could we figure out how to layer a foundation in for some either existing meat processors or new meat processors to make a decision as to whether or not they would expand existing facilities or build from scratch. And so we basically had three objectives in this feasibility study. The first one was which was truly a feasibility study, was to understand the target customers through collecting data from farmers. So this was really targeted as a farmer, not as the end consumer, but as the farmer who is the initial consumer of a meat processor. Did they need, did they actually need this? Because there's everybody hears that they need it, but we wanted some hard data to do that. So we conducted a study, had 54 people that answered the study, and you can get the study and have all the details. The second part was in doing this, we were thinking, if we're providing foundational building blocks for somebody else to do their own feasibility study or business plan, what would we want to add to that? So that was best practices and innovation. So we went around to non-competitive meat processors in the New England region. Brooks Miller, a farmer and local meat processor who processes it on his own farm, went around and did a study and found some really innovative stuff that we also included in here as a foundational building block. And then the last piece, which happens in every feasibility study or business plan that we get asked for, which is, where do I find money and what is the organizational structure? So we put together a pretty comprehensive list, although subsequently I've had more people call me and say, hey, I want to be on that list of funders. So those funders are both national and local, and they're in the study. They actually identify funders who have funded meat processing plants in particular, and funders who have not. So somebody looking to start thinking about this, at the very least, I mean, I've got the resources here. It's a massive piece, but you can get it as a PDF, and it tells you, have they funded it before and what would they fund? And then the last piece was, and again, we get this question all the time, which is, business structure. Should I be a nonprofit, a for-profit, an LLC, a subchapter S? And so we put together, with the help of an attorney, a basic guide to thinking about what that business structure would be. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but the whole base concept here was, can we provide the average person with a foundational information and or approach? Now, those of you who are not in Southeast Pennsylvania might come back and say, but I can't use the data. You might not be able to use the data, but you could use the questions and the structure, which would lead to good, solid answers. Although, again, after having done it, I think there's some things we might have modified. But for the most part, it gave us good data for someone to make some decisions about who or what or how they would or wouldn't build and or improve a meat processor. So that was funded by Blue Yak and PASA, and it is available publicly either on our website or PASA's website. Rebecca, Frimmer, back to you.
Yeah, the two Rebeccas. Thanks, Ted. So we are going to come back to some of the things that Ted talked about. They're just usually like a later section of the feasibility study, so we'll round back to that shortly. We're going to start by talking about market analysis. And I'll use this leg up study as an example of how we executed some market analysis, as well as talk a little bit about another study that we did in the southern tier of New York State. So as it says, an effective market study is made up of primary and secondary research, along with a deep understanding of the gap that needs to be filled and how we can capture and keep our new customers. So market analysis, just talking about some of the words on this slide, market analysis is doing our market research and then drawing conclusions, right? It sounds really fancy, but that's really all we're doing. And when we talk about a market study being made up of primary and secondary research, the primary research segment is the new research that we're going to do by talking to our prospective customers. And those that fit into our target audience. We might have more than one type of prospective customer. And then the secondary research is just the synthesis of existing research that already exists out there in the universe and figuring out if our primary research lines up with general research that's already been done, or if we're learning something new, or if we can maybe identify that we have some outliers that we want to ignore. So that's really the purpose of that. So in our primary research, we want to identify the pool of participants that we want to talk to. So the pool is really representative of our prospective customers. And then we want to think about whether we need to look for broader response to include an entire target audience. So what I mean by that is, are there different customer profiles? Like, for example, in the project that Ted was discussing, going to Pennsylvania Association of Sustainable Agriculture and using their list was a match because we were looking for services that would appeal to like pasture-based and more sustainable types of farms. So is that right? Like, can you just go to one entity for a list, or do you need to look at various ways of gathering participants for your research so that you're covering the different types of target customers that you might be serving? Are you being geographically relevant? Is this the right geographic area for the facility that you're going to be building, or do you need to go broader or narrower? And then, is it statistically relevant? Do you have a big enough survey audience to have a good chunk of data to analyze and make sure that you can identify if there are like weird responses or outliers that need to get tossed out? So you want to make sure that you have a critical mass of data. So just briefly relating this back to the Leg Up study, Ted mentioned that we surveyed 54 farms, which we did. We wanted to make sure that we had enough survey responses to represent a large sum of animals being processed. That was like the critical mass of data point that we were looking at. So the responses actually represent 100,000 animals being processed per year. That sounds crazy huge, but if you think about the fact that a lot of that is chickens, it doesn't sound so crazy. 4,000 of those animals in the processing survey were beef and pork. So the list of farms, and then as I said, the list of farms was sourced from a membership organization that directly correlated to the target audience, and they wanted to cooperate because they wanted to be part of getting these answers. Sometimes economic development organizations are interested in helping provide lists to get those answers too, or maybe your local extension will help you get in touch with your local meat farmers. On a different project, we did a lot of primary research via interviews. And the project that Ted was discussing, we did it via email. You could go either way. When you're doing interviews, I think you get a lot more nuanced data, but obviously your data pool is going to be a lot smaller. So when we did the project in this western southern tier of New York, we did primary research with a very specific farmer profile where we went one-on-one on the farm with 20 different farms. And we wanted to identify farms that were using direct-to-consumer sales channels. And so we had a small list, and we were able to have long interviews and get very nuanced information and storytelling about their processing experience, their sales activities, and their needs. And it was just a first step, but it just depends on the depth of information that you're looking for, or if you're looking to go broader and get, you know, more numbers in your data. So moving on to secondary research, in order to understand how the primary research that we've done connects with published data on the subject, we want to evaluate and make some conclusions about what we're reading in the published data. And that data is usually going to come from government entities or nonprofit entities because they're the ones that are out there, you know, gathering all this information. So here are just some examples, and I'll walk through those and then talk about an example of work that we did to relate it back. So the USDA obviously has lists of processors by region if you want to look at your competition and what services they're offering, and come up with some numbers statistically of what services are available across the board. USDA also publishes some reports on direct-to-consumer, so we can understand those trends, how many farmers are, you know, selling direct-to-consumer in different regions and what their needs might be. We can look at different livestock types and cross-reference that with primary research results. So the USDA, the Ag Census reports will tell us the number of farms in different states and regions and the number of animals that are being raised on those farms and whether those are, you know, small to mid-sized farms or large farms, and you can cross-reference that numerical data against your pool of respondents in your primary research. And then thinking about, do these activities line up with what you've assumed based on your primary research, or something really different, maybe telling you might be missing a pool of people that you need to be talking to. There's also general publications about market trends that are out there. in the industry. You could read case studies. There's a whole page on the extension website of meat processing case studies. Obviously, other sources, like there's more articles on the NMPAN website. Vermont Farm to Plate has a ton of information in their strategic plan that might give you some ideas about the questions you want to be asking or the types of statistics that you want to be looking for. And so other regional or state reports are great sources of inspiration for coming up with the kinds of data you need to collect. If you're looking for more than you're getting just from, like looking at TED's leg up study, for example. And then your local news is going to inform you about new competitor developments and just make sure you're aware of what else is going on outside your bubble. And before I get to this last bullet point, I'll just relate it back to an example. So during the feasibility study that we conducted in Southwest New York State, for our secondary research, we looked at, I'll just give you a little list so you can get an idea. We looked at census of agriculture data in the region on beef, cattle, and hog livestock populations and whether they were increasing or decreasing between the census taking years, and then what % of those were on small to mid-sized farms, because that was our target. We looked at ag marketing service reports from the USDA, which come out weekly and give you information on pricing in different livestock products. And then we looked at some national reports. This first bullet point, other publications about market trends. We looked at specifically the National Food Hub Survey to see trends, and another report that's called Trends in Local and Regional Food Systems, a report to Congress, that had a lot of information about direct-to-consumer trends. And then we looked at various farming and food organizations in the region to see what relevant articles and research they'd done and they were offering. So that gives you an idea of how you could build a secondary research plan. The local legislation bullet point here is just a note. You really want to engage your local government early on in the process. You need to connect with someone who's going to be a champion for your project, understand its economic development incentives as far as building a regional food economy, and be an advocate for you to get all of the permits and regulatory stuff passed that you're going to need to get your plant up and running. By reading your local news and understanding the different attitudes and opinions of the different people in your area, it might help you to understand who you should at least try to connect with to start with. Okay, so we have all this data. How do we temper that data? How do we interpret it and start to understand it? We never want to lose sight of the ultimate question as to what problem needs to be solved. So if you're an entrepreneur, what you're probably trying to do is set the stage for a successful business, right? So you want to make sure you do your homework, you can get your investors, and you can get this thing started and turn a profit. If you're a facilitator, your perspective may be different. You might be looking to improve the local food economy of a region and build a foundation that would attract an entrepreneur to come in and do this next step. So you might be really looking to prove whether or not there really is a need. So the perspective is different, facilitator versus entrepreneur. So that will shift your frame of reference a little bit around the data and probably the way that you look at competition, right? Entrepreneur kind of looks at killing competition, and facilitators kind of look at, is there a way to strengthen what's already there and facilitate the existing plants to do a better job serving the needs of the farmer before necessarily recommending that something new come right in. With this study, the leg up study, the goal was to create that broad foundation, as Ted said, the building blocks for the next level of a business plan so someone else could move forward. Other studies that we've done have been for the facilitation of a plant's funding, finding the right funding partners for the plant. Ask yourself, what problem are you solving, so that this frame of reference is going to change the way you go about your primary research and also the way you analyze your data, to make sure that you're gathering exactly what you need to answer your specific question. And then this last bullet point, addressing what's the pain of change, because we often hear in different areas, oh, we need a new meat processing plant. Everybody's really unhappy with what's available to them. They're driving too far, or their meat's gone missing, or they're not happy with the value-added services that are available. But it's kind of dangerous to base a huge investment and plan for a new plant on like some general commiserating that might be going on in the community. So you want to make sure you take that to the next level and determine whether or not there really is enough of a call for change or enough demand that's not being met that it makes sense to move forward. And that's what the feasibility study is all about. So this comment about the pain of change, you know, is it going to be more painful for customers to switch over to your service or to just deal with the one or two things that are bothering them about the service that they're already in? So you really want to dig deep and find out what the real situation is on the ground level. Talk to as many of your prospective customers as you can, and then move forward with the rest of your study. So this addresses that a little bit, this next slide about adding immediate value. How are you going to capture those new customers? So in the leg up study, Brooks went around and talked to a lot of different processors and found out what features and services they were offering. Some of them are listed here in the bullet points. And we were also able to ask farmers to check off what services they were already receiving and what services they'd really like to receive. And you can look at that in the leg up study. It's pretty informative. So this slide just outlines some outcome of the survey of other processors' offerings and is a little inspiration for you to start thinking about what is your competition doing, what is the real local need, and how can we leverage that local need or that gap in the marketplace to create our own niche. So as entrepreneurs, we can be excellent at something and have our plant or our processing facility be super strong in certain areas that allow it to shine and be a first choice for lots of customers. It's important not to just recreate something that already exists that just might be a little more convenient or have friendlier customer service. You really want to think about how you can add value overall. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Ted. He's going to go through the next couple of sections, and he's going to talk about the workforce assessment piece and business structures, and then I'll wrap it up in the end with talking about funding your project.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. So workforce assessment. So, you know, one of the most important things we hear today, especially in the meat processing world, is finding capable individuals to work in the business. There's not a lot of training. People haven't been doing it. It's not the most glamorous job. And so in doing a feasibility study, one of the important things is that you understand the availability of both employees and trained employees. And so I have a really simple approach to that during a feasibility study is you use something called Google, right? And you literally go out to the area that you're in and you do a Google. And you Google workforce assessment or workforce availability, the county that you're in, economic development, the county you're in, and unemployment and the county you're in. And that's the place where we start all of that, because as Rebecca said earlier, get in touch with your legislatures, the people in the community that understand that, and start having those conversations, because twofold happens. One, you know, maybe they don't want you in the community, or two, maybe they do want you in the community, and because that is what becomes semi-skilled labor, and theoretically as you grow the business, it hires more semi-skilled people and has the opportunity to effectively be manufacturing, which is a core, you know, can be a very core, stable, foundational part of a community. People may be very happy to do that. So that's the first thing is you want to know, because if you set up a building and you spend the millions of dollars that you might save by doing a feasibility study, and there is not labor readily available, you have a problem. So how do we figure it out? I mean, you know, just as I just said, you talk to a bunch of people, you look for competitors in the industry, you look for like-minded type of businesses, and then you have to do recruiting. I mean, and a combination of recruiting and training. And one of the things that we've learned in any business is that you have to constantly be looking for good people. I have a saying, if you're going to go fishing, the first and most important thing is that you have your line in the water, right? If the line isn't in the water, you're not going to catch anything. And oh, by the way, you probably want to put a little bit of a lure or some kind of bait on the end of it. So in the recruiting process, you should be constantly recruiting. And part of that is developing the relationships with people that know that you're looking for somebody, so that you get a pipeline and a funnel of people coming in. Even as you're doing the feasibility study, you start laying that foundation. Go ahead. And then business structure. So we get asked this question like all the time. What, you know, should I be a fill in the blank, nonprofit, LLC, for-profit, corporation, C Corp, S Corp? So I think there's another slide here that I put the 3 points. Number one, or 4 points. Number one, keep it simple. Like as you're getting started, it's really easy to make this really, really complicated really fast. We're doing a multi-member LLC agreement right now. $3,600. because we have some things that we particularly want to do, and it's actually for a company that we own part of. That's not cheap, especially for a startup. So keeping it pretty simple to start is important. Coming back to it afterwards is probably important too. The second piece the second most important question is how many owners are going to be there. So if it's a single owner, just start an LLC, be done with it. It'll be easy. If it's a multiple owner, you may have to do a subchapter S or C Corp or an S Corp or something else. And then there's the whole nonprofit venue, which, you know, is a whole nother, you know, option. But in this world, I'm not particularly enamored with a meat processor that's nonprofit. And then the next question is who has control, right? So depending on the way that you set that up, it's going to change the type of control and the way control can be spread amongst people. Now, in the state of New Jersey, everybody has in an LLC, everybody has an equal vote. In other states, that doesn't work that way. So you want to be very careful as you set that up that you want. And then the last thing is ask your accountant about the tax considerations. So you've got pass-through entities, you've got entities where the ownership and the control changes the way it passes through. And, you know, asking some good, simple questions is really important. And many times you can find lawyers in your community, if you get a referral, who will do the setup or formation documents at a reasonable fee with the hope that they will get more work from you in the future, because it's a pretty much, usually it's a cut and dry kind of cookie cutter approach. Same thing with accountants. But back to the study in the back, and you can get this as a download. There is a business structures, you know, I think there's about 20 of them that we went through, actually more than that, about 30 of them that we went through, giving the pros and cons of it. And rather than getting into all this, you can see there's an example here. Gives you a lot of ideas. But quite honestly, get a little help from somebody, you know, a lawyer and or accountant for doing this, because at least from my experience, you can really mess things up if you don't get that help. But keep it simple.
All right, I'm going to pick it up here, Ted. Thank you.
You're welcome.
At the same time, I agree with Ted, you should get some help, but read this first. So you get all your vocabulary down and understand sort of the breadth of options out there, but definitely a little bit intimidating of an area to tackle. This is a good example of one where working with a consultant or an expert might really be helpful. So next we'll talk a little bit about funding the project. This is always an area where folks seem to want a little bit of help. So the Leg Up study, as Ted mentioned, identifies over a dozen funding sources. They represent loans, lines of credit, grants, equity funding, as well as identifying some specific grants that are available from the USDA, SBA, and local entities. So take a look at that. It's a great starting point. And then also in your conversations with local economic development folks and consultants, you may identify some other funding sources you never knew about, and never underestimate the power of some good lengthy internet searching. The next bullet point here, the high-level vision for the plant, startup costs for equipment and infrastructure. So at this point, once you're starting to think about funding, you really want to have a back-of-the-napkin scope of how much you need. So by back of the napkin, I mean that like quick, down and dirty, shorter version of a budget or a startup cost plan, so that you have an idea of how big this plant is going to be, or you want it to be, and how much cash flow you're going to have at the end of the day to service that debt or equity financing. So when we break that down, what does that really mean? That means we need a reality check on our startup costs. So what do we need to get into the building and put all the equipment in there? And then the cash flow, what's our revenue coming in the door? So what is approximately the number of animals we'd like to be processing on a yearly basis and the average cost per animal? That gives you that high level idea of where to start. And then working down through some of your high-level costs for operations, just at a high level, so you have a general idea of what your profit might be at the end of the day, and can you afford to pay back those loans over a reasonable period of time. This is a point where it would be probably helpful to work with a consultant or someone who's run a plant in the past, or have a mentor that you can talk to. And when we think about building a budget, which you're not doing yet, that's definitely business plan stuff, not feasibility stuff. But if you need a place to ground your thinking as far as like a high level basic structure for what are the different areas of cost that go into running any business, and specifically in this case with a processing facility, this is a list that you can turn to. And obviously copies of the slide deck are available for anyone who wants it after afterwards. These first 3 bullet points, assets, liability, and equity, are your balance sheet accounts. Those will tell you a little bit about your startup costs and the loans that you're going to need. But when you think about what am I really looking at, for figuring out the cost of running this thing, at a high level, you want to think about your cost of goods sold, your labor, your operating costs, your administrative costs, and your fixed expenses of financing, right? So what are you going to be paying in interest? And then your one-time expenses. So, what are you going to have to do in the beginning for equipment and getting up and running that you may not have to do again down the road every single year? And that will sort of feed back into your assets and liabilities equation. So this gives you a rough framework to go ahead and start thinking about that back of the napkin assessment on finances. Before I go on to the next slide, I'll just say I'm going to pass it to Ted. He's going to talk about this infographic that we developed, and then we'll move into wrap up and Q&A. And we'll be here to answer all your questions. Go ahead, Ted. Take away the next slide.
Yeah, I love this infographic. So, you start with, how do I fund my meat processing operation? Do I have the money to invest in the business? Yes or no? Do I have a robust personal network? No. If you do, go try, finding money from friends and family or crowdfunding. Is this an established business? Then it becomes easier to go out to get grants or loans or business assets. But the bottom line is that what we have found in raising money, like, that is probably the easiest thing you can do once you have a really good either feasibility study or business plan or operating business. Money is, I think many times we hear people, I don't know how to raise the money. And the answer is you build the plan. And if the plan makes sense, it's not hard to raise the money. Those categories of chart of accounts, the way you build a budget, the capital expenditures, the setup costs, this is all about building the plan out. So if you just have an idea, I want to build a meat processor and I want $1 million, nobody's going to listen to you. But if you take the time to do the feasibility study, to understand the marketplace, to say that there's a need, to start building out, some rough estimates of what it's going to cost, and then you want to talk to somebody about funding it, they will have a significantly greater interest because you've laid the groundwork and the foundation in order to be able to do that. The funding, again, is the easiest part of this, because if you've done all your homework correctly, somebody says, I can get a return on that funding, whether it's a community return or a return on the investment that's literal, that's not the problem. So, there's lots of different options. As we said, there's funding sources here. There's a couple dozen here. There's venture capital, incubators, grants and loans, angel investors, everything that you've seen here. Build the feasibility study, and then investors will come if it says to do it. So what is this study telling us? Our study didn't necessarily come back and say we need another meat processor. It definitely said the meat processors in the area could do a better job. There's some question about capacity, and there was some question about some services that they particularly were offering. But at the end of the day, it didn't come back and conclusively say we better build another meat processor or start another meat processor here. But that's ultimately what you want that study to tell you is, should I take the next step and do it? And it can be fairly down and dirty to get this information put together, and that what you want to do is get the feasibility study done as quickly but as effectively as possible, so that you can then go on and do a deeper dive into the business plan, which is going to take more of an investment of time and money to figure out, but it gives you the starting point. Contact information, if you'd like, I think Rebecca Thistlethwaite probably has copies of this that you can download, but you're certainly welcome to call or email either me or Rebecca, and then any questions you have.
All right, so I'm going to facilitate the Q&A now. Thank you guys so much. We've got a couple questions that have come in already. Annie asks, I'm unclear on the jump between the primary and secondary research that you do and really understanding the market opportunity. How do you go from surveying some people and getting some background research to feeling confident in a market size, price point, scale, etc.? Great question.
I'm going to let Rebecca Frimmer answer that question.
I'll start this, and I think Ted's probably going to have something to add. So to jump between primary and secondary research. So really you're using secondary research to temper what you think you've collected in primary research and see if it seems like you've done enough research to match with some of the local data that's available in your area. And the secondary research also just helps to prove or disprove your theories about different trends in the marketplace and different needs in the marketplace and the way that the local food movement is moving as a whole. As far as getting some confidence in the market size, the price point, and the scale, I think real confidence in your price point and your scale is probably going to come later when you do your business plan. But I think the primary and secondary research in the feasibility study is going to give you an understanding of the potential volume of animals that could come through your plant. And, you know, if you're going into feasibility study, you probably already have some kind of like a gut idea of how big you want to be. And you can use the data that you're collecting as a sanity check as far as the market size. Like, are you able to identify anywhere close to that, that flow of supply and have a good understanding of where it might come from? I mean, as far as price points, you can use the USDA reports as like a general way of checking yourself as far as like what is the meat selling for in the marketplace or at different levels along the value chain. And then thinking about whether your customer is going direct to consumer or they are going to distributors, it'll help you to understand, you know, what price they can bear for processing. But really your competitive analysis is going to give you an idea of what people are used to paying for your services. I don't know if there's any follow-up question to that, but that's at least where I'd start. And Ted,
Can I add?
You can just add it. You have to raise your hand.
Rebecca and I are famous for interrupting each other. So from my perspective, you know, you're kind of, when you're in that feasibility study world, which is what Rebecca's talking about, I'm totally fine with kind of that general, go out and do some random, do some surveys and get a little bit deeper. But if you're going to go raise a bunch of money in this world, I would literally go lock up customers. I would go door to door to farmers and say, I'm planning on building this. I'd like you to sign up. I'd like you to, here's the pricing I'm thinking about. If I do this and this and this and do these things, how many animals were you willing to commit a year for me to be processing? Because you're about to go sign a loan or raise equity or get a grant or whatever it is of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. Getting a level of commitment from local farms who are going to use your processor or local wholesalers, depending on how the process works, literally having that commitment will again, remember what I said a few minutes ago, it's easy to raise the money. You have that commitment from X number of animals that somebody says, I will do this if you do this. Makes it that much easier, A, for somebody to fund it, and B, for you to sleep at night once you have funded it. And I would not, I've counseled many entrepreneurs to literally go out and beat the bushes, because you know what, ultimately that's what you're going to have to do. You're going to have to go wear out your shoe leather talking to farmers, wholesalers, retailers, saying, this is what I do. Will you do it? So why not do it ahead of time?
Well, and just one more thing, I think that rounds back to the primary versus secondary research piece. You know, Ted just mentioned 3 distinct different types of potential customers, and so you want to talk to all of those in your primary research. And then as far as asking for people's business before you would move forward, that makes a lot of sense, obviously, but even taking it to the next step, if you're going after economic development funds that are coming from your state government or nonprofit organizations, they may even go as far as asking you for letters of intent from your potential customers.
Well, Ted, the idea of sort of locking in contracts or trying to get some more security in your volume, you know, there was a processing plant in North Carolina, a poultry processing plant, that when they did their feasibility study, found farmers committing about 100,000 birds a year to go through their plant. And the plant operated, I think, for about 6 years, and they never, ever broke 50,000. They never got remotely close to those numbers that farmers, you know, promised they were going to run through that plant, and the plant ultimately failed. And so, you know, what is there anything else that an entrepreneur can do to just feel even more confident that they are going to have the throughput? Should they actually sign written contracts at some point, you know, maybe after they write a business plan or obtain financing or permits, or, you know, what else could you suggest?
So I think there's a couple of creative ways to do that. The first one is actually connect to the farmers. Like,
Yeah.
hey, why don't you have some equity? Why don't you put some investment in here if you're serious about running this? I think many entrepreneurs spend a lot of time wanting to own the whole thing themselves. And my answer is why? I'd rather own part of something than 100% of nothing, right? Which is what ultimately happened there. That's number one. I mean, I'm always in favor of, and I'm not espousing a cooperative necessarily, and I'm not, but if you're getting that level of interest and, Rebecca, you know the difference between a pig and a chicken at breakfast?
One is fattier than the other.
No. A chicken, having provided the egg, is mildly interested. The pig, having provided the bacon, is committed. So if you can get those people that you're out there asking questions of, will you do this, to take an even deeper step, that gives you a stronger business plan, a stronger support. I mean, that they have joint ownerships. Now that's maybe an extreme, but the reality is in the small processor world, it is tough to make ends meet. And so if you want to do this, then make the commitment. You're as a small business owner in a processing world, you are making a commitment to the community. I don't care who or what you are. If you're in the small nature, why not deepen that relationship? So that's one. Number two, certainly contracts. Absolutely, but the contract is only as good as the two people shaking hands at the end of the day. If somebody goes out of business and says, "Well, I promised you 50,000, but I'm out of business," there's not really anything you can do. Then of course it's just it's a constant sales work. One of the things that I find in the world of agriculture that there's two things that are different in the world of agriculture than there is in the rest of the world of business. Number one is of course you get one chance a year. Mother Nature is really inflicting her or helping her way in the business. And the second one is that at least in conventional agriculture, the idea of sales or marketing is that you're timing when you're taking the truck of animals or grain to the auction, and you can convert that almost instantaneously to cash. Whereas in the world of direct marketing and the things that many of the smaller niche meat processors are doing, there's not an insignificant amount of literally sales and marketing work that you have to do that isn't a timing issue. So that's the other part of it is that you have to, as that entrepreneur, once you get started, you have to have designated time, and it's usually got to be your time, because hiring a salesperson can be difficult at best. Actually doing that sales work, if you build it, they may not come, right? So those are the things that I would get. How do you make sure that happens? Certainly contracts, certainly equity, but at the end of the day, it's about wearing out the shoe leather and being out there before, during, and after, and making sure that you're soliciting the business.
So I want to just add to that really quick. Ted makes a good point about that sales piece, which is what I wanted to mention as the other factor to consider. So you probably do have to do it yourself in the beginning as an entrepreneur. However, if you're a farmer that wants to get into processing and you've never really been doing sales outside the farm gate, or if you're somebody who has managed or run a meat processing facility, or you're a highly trained and skilled butcher, but you've never gone off the cutting floor to go sell, you're going to need to get yourself some training or work with a consultant to be successful. So when Ted says wearing out the shoe leather, it's really not an exaggeration. I mean, I was at a conference event yesterday where farmers were talking about stalking as a business strategy. It got a great laugh from the crowd, but that was literally what he said. It takes a lot of persistence, and it takes the appropriate level of follow-up on a certain timeline. You need to really manage your sales pipeline responsibly and regularly, real rhythm of communication around that piece of work if you are going to take it to the next place and be successful in sales. So if you're uncomfortable in sales, you're not experienced in sales, you're going to have to get yourself some help to make that piece happen.
All right, I'm going to move on to the next question, also by Annie. She asked, what were the key elements that came out of your research that told you that the area didn't need another processor, but that existing processors could do better?
Well, so it was not definitive. Let me be clear. It didn't say you absolutely needed a new processor. In fact, that would be what I would call primary research, right? That's a perfect example of the difference between primary and secondary. So we did research that said, you know what, there's a lot of animals. They were having, if I remember correctly, there was two kind of things that came out. The number one thing they said is they would like to have tracking, like yield tracking. And the number two thing was around availability and communication of slaughter spaces. So the yield tracking is just something that somebody could add, but the availability and timing of the slaughter spaces leads me to believe that there's a need. But then I would go out and do secondary research. So in this particular case, because the survey was being done by PASA actually, though that's not true because Kitchen Table added some names to the list that were participating, so we actually were our own names. But if I was going to go build a processor now, I would go ask PASA if I could go talk to some out of their names, go talk to our own, and get a deeper one-on-one conversation to say, well, what would it take, or what do you need in order to do that? So I want to be careful to say that this is primary research that came back and said and I don't ever expect primary research to be definitive. I expect it to quickly say, should we do more research or should we run away? In this case, I think it says you should do more research because you don't want to go raise $100,000 million without doing that next level of research. Oh, I want to add one more. There's two. The number one thing that makes a business fail is lack of profit. And the number one thing that makes a business succeed is tenacity. So the wearing out the shoe leather, I mean, across the few hundred or close to 300 businesses that Kitchen Table has worked with since its inception, farms fail because of lack of profit, and farms succeed because and any business succeeds because the entrepreneur is tenacious. They do not quit, which sometimes doesn't help, but go ahead. Sorry, Rebecca.
Oh, well, you were mentioning that, there was some seasonal bottlenecks was one of the things that came out of your primary research. So how would you explore that topic further? Like do more interviews with farmers, find out exactly how many animals, what species, what months they need to kill them, and then put together a calendar basically and find out where those bottlenecks are and if there's opportunities to shift things around or what?
So when Rebecca did the feasibility study in the southern tier of New York, one of the things that came back from that feasibility study was lack of communication between the farmer and the processor, mm-hmm. right? That the farmer was calving and raising its animals with its own mindset in mind. I want my calves to calve in the spring because blah, blah, whatever. And by the way, we don't get into production practices, so I'm not making a judgment of that, whether it's good or bad. But that lack of communication, thinking about, well, when is the demand going to come versus the supply, what you said is exactly right. You go out to the farmers and you say, look, here's the peak. The peak times. That's a great way to lock somebody in. I've got a new slaughterhouse. You want the peak times, sign up now, put in equity, I'll lock you in, great, next. And then, so it's a limited resource. And then the other ones you say, hey, if you want to work in my slower times, I can do more things for you. I can give you a better price. I can do whatever. But yes, the point is, you're exactly right. We found, and I don't remember, there was a large number of processors and a large number of farmers Rebecca interviewed. And it came back both sides were saying, there's no communication, or the communication could be a lot better. And in fact, that came out of our study here too, is that it was one of the top things too, that the communication could be better. And whether that's communication around the actual day of the processing or the scheduling or anything else, I don't know. But yes, to answer your question, that communication was one of the top things that came back as needing to be improved.
Okay, moving on to the next question. Annie, again, what if your target market is direct to consumer and you can't exactly get contracts or commitments to buy? How else can you sort of assure sales, I guess? Or be more confident, I guess. I mean, I suppose one way would be to do sort of a CSA type model where you get people to pre-purchase live animals or something like that.
I mean, it's the same thing as the retail model, right? When you open a retail store, how do you ensure a certain level of traffic? Marketing, CSA, shoe leather. I mean, you're never going to be 100% sure. Competition comes in and something changes, but your job is to identify, yeah, sure, in the direct-to-consumer marketplaces, identify the demographic, have the right marketing budget, make sure that you test the marketplace in the process. You may be able to get people to sign up. I worked with an organization here in Philadelphia, Philly Cowshare. We had a waiting list when we started that business. People wanted that product and they were willing to sign up because of the story, and they signed up in advance. So again, even though you're in the direct-to-consumer, I would not assume that you can't get somebody to sign up in advance. But yeah, at the end of the day, you're going to put tenacity, right? That's the point. You're going to be 50% of marketing works. I don't know which 50% works, so I've got to do it all the time, right? So you've got to have that. Rebecca can talk much more eloquently about this than I can, about having not only a marketing strategy, but a marketing execution and a calendar that happens all the time regularly, so you're constantly touching people to make something happen.
Teresa asked a question. The situation we are facing is that the processing plant burned down. We've been offered to buy the store, which is all that's left. What steps are we to take to rebuild and be USDA inspected? Are there guidelines to follow for this? I will say, Teresa, that on our website, the nichemeatprocessors.org, we have a great page on there on getting started and regulatory aspects of getting started. But I would say it would probably be a good idea to do a feasibility study to also find out what kind of volume and sales the previous plant had before they burnt down, and if those customers would come back. Yeah. Any other suggestions there, Ted?
No, I mean, she's asking the question more around regulatory and all that, which goes well beyond the scope of what we did from a feasibility study. But from a business plan, to your point, Rebecca, is like, if you're going to do this, take the before you spend $1 on actually rebuilding, spend $1 on figuring out what it's going to take to rebuild.
Mm-hmm. Susan had a good question. Do you think the distribution between red meat and poultry might have skewed the assessment of the need for processors in that region of Pennsylvania? For example, perhaps a need for poultry processors, but a need for the existing red meat processors to offer different services?
So that's an interpretation of the results, which as a consultant, I work hard not to assess too hard, but to help help clients do that. When I looked at that, I just kind of went, look, this is ultimately the goal here was to give somebody else a foundation to make that decision with. So Susan, I apologize, but I don't have a strong opinion on that. What the answer is that I would do secondary. If this was a client that came to us and said, hey, what should I do now? I would do secondary research. That's the whole point. You're asking a great question, which is, what does this really mean? Well, we didn't get the exact answers. Now I would go back and ask those questions in a deeper way. So that is what primary research is meant to do, is to help you refine the next layer of questions that you need to ask.
At that point, you might look at the competition, like who is already processing poultry in the region and what is their volume and do they have excess capacity? Are farmers complaining about a lack of ability to get chickens processed? I know in that area, mobile processing is something that is available. So those are all the kind of next phase questions that you would ask and then go research. And then if you determine that there still was a need, you might think about what is the best solution for that need. But this study was designed to focus on beef and pork processing. So while we understand the number of chickens that were in the region, that wasn't necessarily the question we were answering with this study, which is, why I had mentioned in my slides, you really want to think about the question you're answering so the data serves that need. So if we were asking this particular question about chickens, we would have probably structured the questions differently and then had more data to look at and done some competitive analysis on poultry processors as well.
I just have one more question and then we're at our hour. At what point do you start talking to potential funders? Is it during the feasibility study? Is it during the business plan phase? Is it between the two? Is it after you've fully wrapped up the business plan? What do you suggest?
I think you do the feasibility study before you start talking to potential funders. From my standpoint, as I said over and over again, the funding is the easiest part. So go make sure that in fact there is a need, you know, from a demand standpoint, or at least you think there is a need, so that you can talk intelligently. I mean, you know, that was part of the reason to do this, was because everybody said, oh, we need processing plants in Southeast Pennsylvania. And the answer is, well, maybe we do, but I feel better about going to a potential funder of saying, look, this is the study that we did and this is what it came back with. We're not 100% sure. I mean, here's the other piece is an entrepreneur will take this, which is great, and make some decisions, which is also great, and then start making some deeper questions. But I would have no problems going to a funder with this study and saying, hey, we think we're going to do this. Do you have an interest? Here's the data. A funder will come back fairly quickly and go no or yes based upon what they see here. But I would not talk to funders until I have something slightly more than, I have a really good idea that I thought of, you know, been thinking about for the last year. You need to do some research. You're asking someone to sign a large check. You don't get 2 bites at that apple with the same person. If you go to them with a half-baked idea, they're not going to talk to you again. They're going to go, you're wasting time.
Okay, well, we are a couple minutes after. I wanted to thank everyone for sticking with us for this hour. We are going to post this video on our YouTube channel by next week. I also will provide a link to the slides and a link to the study that they referenced in the slides to all of our participants. So thank you, Ted and Rebecca, so much, and Mark for your facilitation, and I hope everybody has a wonderful day.
Thanks, folks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.